Into WWPT 90.3 FM. This is Trock Talk. We have a very special edition of Trock Talk today, as we have a very special guest. We have SNY Mets writer Joe DeMayo here. We're going to be interviewing him in just a couple of minutes. And we're back here on WWPT 90.3 FM. So, Joe, I know that you have a big following on Twitter. And before we got started with the Mets questions, I just wanted to ask you what your Twitter handle was. It's PSL to Flushing. What does that mean?
Yeah, so I mainly cover the minor leagues for the most part, and Mets minors start in Port St. Lucie. PSL is short. And ideally, they end in Flushing with the Mets and Queens. So, yeah, kind of the whole just start to finish.
Wow, okay. I also know that you're a big Cowboy fan. So before we also got started on Mets, I wanted to hear your opinion on the Dak Prescott deal.
They had to get it done, in my opinion. I think they kind of waited 2 years too long to do it. They probably could have got him for about $10 million or less a year if they did it a couple of years ago. But the last thing that I want to see is them fall into quarterback purgatory of sorts where they have nothing. So it was a necessary evil, cost a lot of money, but that's kind of the way the quarterback market works, where it's basically whatever you get, the next guy will get what you got plus a little more, and then so on and so forth. So Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson, those guys are probably next, so they'll get just a little more than Dak did.
Yeah. All right, so as we're talking now, the Mets are playing the Cardinals in a spring training game, and Francisco Lindor just hit his first home run in the Met uniform. It actually happened to be a grand slam. So speaking of Lindor, what's the latest that you've heard on contract extension talks with him and with Michael Conforto?
So they're in discussions with Lindor, more so than Conforto. Not a ton going on with Conforto. I think he's likely to at least test free agency. Doesn't mean the Mets won't be able to keep him long term, but I think they'll have to ultimately compete with, the rest of the game to do so next offseason. Lindor's an interesting one. Andy Martino, a colleague of mine over at SNY, reported earlier today that the Mets, I guess, quote unquote, current offer to Lindor is just a hair under $300 million. And Lindor wants over $300 million. So they have a bit of a gap to bridge, but I think it's doable. And frankly, I think it's a deal that makes sense for, if you're Lindor, I think you want to sign an extension with the Mets now, because they're obviously going to offer you a lot of money. And next offseason, the shortstop market is flooded in free agency. Trevor Story's out there, Corey Seager, Javi Baez, Carlos Correa. And then Lindor, obviously, if he didn't sign. So you don't really want to be competing with, 4 or 5 other elite players at your position in free agency. So I just have this gut feeling they're going to get it done before opening day. I think it just makes sense for both parties. I think Steve Cohen and the Mets want to make a statement that, they will pay a franchise player a franchise-type salary. And then, obviously, from the case of Lindor, I don't think he wants to do free agency where he has to compete with all these guys. And, he'd still get paid a lot of money, of course, but it's not the same, whereas Conforto would be like clearly the best corner outfielder on the free agent market. So he'd do really well.
And so with the Tatis deal, the Tatis deal, do you think that's going to affect, or do you think that has affected the talks that the Mets have had with Lindor so far?
I don't think so. I think they're totally different deals. Like, I don't think Lindor's looking for a 14-year deal. I don't think the Mets want to do a 14-year deal. So not really. I think what you would take from the Tatis deal is maybe like the back half of the deal, which is like his free agent years or so. And those are, I think, $34 million a year or something at that point. And I think Lindor might want to be close to that area, $30 to $34 million a year. And I think the Mets got to do it. Just make it happen. To me, I think I'd be looking 8 to 10 years at, in that $30 to $34 million a year range. That's what I would be offering if I had the keys to the Mets and Steve Cohen's wallet, because it's not my money.
Yeah. And in the Lindor deal, the Mets not only got Lindor, they also got Carlos Carrasco, who really hasn't done much this spring. It seems like he hasn't pitched in any actual games. I know he's done a lot of bullpen sessions. Yeah. But news came out yesterday that he strained his hamstring, and then I think I saw somewhere that it actually might be a tear of the hamstring. Yeah. So what's the latest that you've heard on his timeline for return?
I think they're calling it a strain, publicly at least, and they're looking at 6 to 8 weeks. So I would have an estimation that you're going to be without Carrasco for at least 2 months. So you might be looking at June or so with him, which is kind of important, that the Mets brought in Joey Lucchesi and Jordan Yamamoto and grabbed, further rotation depth, because it's going to stink, because I think Carrasco would have been the number 2 on the team behind DeGrom. So missing that for a good period of time kind of stinks, but they set themselves up better with depth this year than they have in years past. And frankly, it might even work out that Syndergaard coming back from Tommy John and Carrasco both returned to the team at around the same time.
Yeah, and so before Carrasco got hurt, we were assuming that for the time being, Peterson would get that 5th spot in the rotation, or the 4th spot, I believe, right? Because they have DeGrom, Carrasco, and Stroman. And
Taijuan Walker.
And Taijuan Walker, yes. Yep. And then we were assuming that Peterson would get penciled into that 5th spot. And before then, so it would have been Lucchesi and Yamamoto, and I'm guessing one of them would have gone to the bullpen, and the other one would have gone down to the minors or the alternate site. But now it's probably going to be Peterson in the 4, and then at 5 it's going to be between Yamamoto and Lucchesi. Is that the way that you see it, or do you see it as a three-way race for 2 spots?
No, I think Peterson's going to be the 4. Louis Rojas, the manager, kind of said as such today that Peterson basically had a spot in the rotation. So I think the 5th spot is Lucchesi versus Yamamoto, and then it'll be an interesting debate if they put one of them in the bullpen to kind of, have some length out of the bullpen, because you're going to have guys on innings limits this year because of the shortened season last year, and then you'll have guys coming off injury like Carrasco and Syndergaard. So it'll be interesting to see how they handle whoever doesn't become the 5th starter. But, yeah, I think it's a 2-man race, and I would put my money on Lucchesi, but we'll see how that shakes out over the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, and speaking of a 2-man race, you could see a 2-man race at third base for the Mets between somebody who's been very impressive this spring in Luis Guillorme and J.D. Davis. Do you see it being a race and maybe a platoon type situation there, or do you see Davis winning that and Guillorme just being a utility player?
I struggle to see how the Mets can not find a way to get Luis Guillorme in the lineup as much as possible. So to me, I'd look at it maybe not like a straight platoon per se, but definitely I don't look at it as Guillorme is the backup, JD is the starter. I think you just play it situationally based on the pitcher you're facing, based on their skill set. So if it's a pitcher that you think Guillorme will be more successful against, left-handed or right-handed, then you put him in there, because I think his glove is a stark difference from JD's. JD is just frankly not a very good defensive third baseman, and Guillorme is a plus defensive infielder at second, short, or third. So yeah, I'd very much like to see more of Guillorme. He's had an awesome spring, and then of course it's a 162 game season, so he's had a good month, but who's to say he doesn't come out and struggle in April, and then it's just like, well, I guess JD's playing every day because Guillorme's not hitting. So you have to just kind of find that balance, but I don't think J.D. Davis should feel very secure in his third base role.
And speaking of other players that have had good springs so far, of course, Pete Alonso's just been absolutely raking so far. And prior to the season, when we didn't really know if there was going to be a DH or not, We assumed if there was a DH that Alonso would be moved to the DH spot, Dom Smith would play first, then you could move Nimmo to left, and then you could put Almora or Pilar in center. But with the DH without the DH, it seems like the Mets defense really gets a big downgrade, even though the offense is still going to be there. So do you think that with Nimmo and Smith out in the outfield, do you think that's going to be a really big liability and the reason that they lose games? Or do you think that their offense is going to make up for that?
I think it will cost them some games for sure. It's nothing against Nimmo and Dom Smith. They're trying their hardest out there. It's just those are not where they should play. Nimmo should be a left fielder, like you said, and Dom Smith should be a first baseman. But the lack of a DH pinned them in a corner, and they have no choice but to do it because you're not going to sit any of those guys' backs because, I mean, those are, Dom Smith had MVP votes. Pete Alonso is a year removed from hitting 53 or 54 home runs, whatever it was. Nimmo is an on-base machine and an ideal leadoff hitter for all these great hitters that the Mets have. So you have to suck it up a little bit defensively, and you'll see stuff late in game, I think. Late in game, they'll pull Nimmo out, put Almora or Pilar in center, or pull Dom out and put Pilar in left. So they'll work it out, but on a day-to-day basis, the Mets are going to be defensively challenged a little bit again this year, unfortunately.
And I remember last year when Louis would make changes later on in the games, and he would take out a guy like Nimmo in a situation where you would want Nimmo instead of a guy like Billy Hamilton. And so there's moments like that where it's not only the defense that's a liability, but the fact that you have to make these defensive replacements can end up being an offensive liability, especially later on in games.
Yeah, and I think they did a better job this year. I think if you put Kevin Pilar in the game, he's not, an invalid at the plate. Like he's going to give you a professional at bat. And Almora's looked pretty good this spring too, as well. So I think they did a better job of prepping themselves with, hey, these guys are going to be defensive upgrades, but they're not going to be offensive liabilities at the same thing. I think their depth is significantly better than it's been in years past. And I think that will be helpful and just give Rojas more options. That's really what you want to do is set up your manager to be able to do whatever he wants to do and switch guys out and not feel like he's ruining the game on one side of the ball by doing so.
Yeah. And we were talking earlier about trades that went down, the Lindor trade specifically, but there were other trades that the Mets were in. So there was the trade to acquire Joey Lucchesi from the Padres, where they were kind of a part of the three-way trade. And then they also acquired Khalil Lee in that three-way trade between the Royals and the Red Sox. So out of those two moves, which player do you think is going to have a bigger effect on the team? Well, of course it's Lucchesi. But in the future, let's say in the next 3 seasons, which player do you think is going to have a bigger effect on the team?
Probably. If we're looking ahead, I think Khalil Lee has some real upside. He struggled in spring training at the plate. He's really got to work on better contact skills. He's got some power. He's got some speed. He's got a really, really strong arm. He could play all 3 outfield spots. So I think he's a value. I think Lucchesi's a short-term play, which is fine. I mean, you play this out year to year with pitchers. I mean, the pitching depth you have this year won't be the same next year, and then the year after it'll be different. You change that out kind of year to year. But for this year, it's certainly Joey Lucchesi. But long-term, I'll give the nod to Khalil Lee.
And I know that your specific prowess, I guess, in Mets reporting is with the prospects. So if you had to give me like the top 5 prospects right now, I know Brett Beatty's been playing very well so far in spring training. Yeah. But if you had to give me your top 5 prospects just across the entire organization, who would you say they are?
So I put out a top 20 on SNY.TV. I had Brett Beatty number 5. So third baseman Brett Beatty number 5. Center fielder Pete Crow Armstrong number 4, who was the first round pick in 2020. Number 3 was shortstop Ronnie Mauricio, who's had a really nice spring. He was the number 1 prospect a year ago. Number 2 is 2019 third rounder Matt Allen, right-handed pitcher, who's been big hype this spring, spending a lot of time with Jacob deGrom, learning. I think he's really, really good. And then the number one prospect in the system for me is catcher Francisco Alvarez. And the reason I put him number one over Allen is I think they're actually pretty close as far as prospects go. But I basically asked myself, who do you think is most likely to make an all-star team? And the answer was Alvarez, and that was really my tiebreaker.
So with Alvarez and with Mauricio, two guys where the Mets signed, if they can get Lindor to a long-term deal, they also signed McCann to a 4-year deal. So if these guys are up, or if Alvarez is up in the next 4 seasons, and Mauricio, what do you think these guys do? Do they try to learn a different position, or do they just sit on the bench for a couple of years behind these other players?
I think Mauricio will have to play another position, and he said as such last week that he'd be open to second or third base. So I think Mauricio would have to do a position switch. Alvarez, I think his potential big league arrival really lines up with close to the end of the McCann deal. And at that point, McCann will be a mid-30s catcher. So it might even be a possibility that when Alvarez comes up, McCann is actually the one that ends up on the bench. So, but these things tend to work themselves out. I tend to not look that far ahead because you never know. The minor leagues is a big time struggle. It takes a long time for some of these kids to get through the system and get to the big leagues. So, we're a long way away from worrying about a Francisco Alvarez or Ronnie Mauricio problem on the big league team. But my philosophy, and, certainly scouts echo this too throughout the league, it's like, if I have way too many good players, I'll figure it out. And the Mets certainly haven't had a problem having way too many good players. So I think this will work itself out.
Yeah, and then you also released a top 5 of prospects who you think are going to have the biggest impact on the Mets this season. And number 1 was Khalil Lee, but we talked about him already. But Thomas Sazpecki, I think that's how you pronounce his name. How do you think he's going to affect the team? Do you think he'll be a reliever, especially in that stacked bullpen that the Mets have? Or do you think he could be maybe a longer-term reliever?
So they're still going to develop him as a starter just so he can continue to grow with his pitches. But he should be in AAA to start the minor league season, which won't be until May now, unfortunately. So he'll go to the alternate site for April and then end up in, AAA to start. And then I think bullpen is probably his long-term home. I don't have faith that his changeup is going to develop to be a good enough third pitch. He could just be a 2-pitch power lefty reliever. I mean, if you put him in the bullpen in short spurts, you might see a guy that's touching 96, 97 with a plus breaking ball. So to me, Sazpecki's long-term future is probably in the bullpen. But for now, they'll continue to develop him as a starter because starters have more value than relievers do. So you might as well try it until you have to make a switch at some point. Then you cross that bridge when you get there.
Yeah. And so we can go back to the big league level for a little bit. The Mets did make a lot of good signings during the offseason. They signed Taijuan Walker, to a 2-year, $20 million deal. They signed James McCann to a 4-year deal. They signed Kevin Pillar, and they made, I believe, a couple of other signings, minor leaguers like Brandon Drury and Jose Martinez. But out of those moves, which one do you think is the best move, and which one do you think will have the biggest impact on the Mets this season?
I think it's both Taijuan Walker, to be honest with you. I like James McCann. I think he's a fine catcher. I think they might have gone a year too long on the deal. Personally, I would have liked to have kept it to 3. But I understand that they didn't want to play in the JT Realmuto game. They didn't want to wait until almost February to see if they could possibly get their catcher. So they did what they had to do to lock him in. I think McCann is probably an average regular, maybe a tick above. Taijuan Walker is exciting. I mean, he's a guy that the metrics suggest he should have not been as good, but it's been that way for his entire career. He's consistently pitching well. I mean, last year he had a 2.7 ERA, I think, in the shortened 2020 off of Tommy John. But the deal is a 2-year deal with a 3rd-year player option. So they have a controllable starting pitcher that at one point was an all-star caliber arm, top prospect. So I'm excited that they added him, and especially now with this Carrasco deal, he's proving that he's going to be even more important to this team than maybe they even initially thought.
Yeah, I'm in agreement that the Walker deal is probably the best deal, but I actually kind of disagree with you on the McCann. I think he's going to have the biggest impact, especially compared to what they had last year with Wilson Ramos, where he's just
for sure.
I mean, he can't do anything defensively behind the plate compared to McCann, who's one of the top 5 in pop time, throwing the ball to throw him out, and he's really a great framer, and he's a really good defensive catcher. And then he's also a guy who batted .290 last year. He was an all-star 2 years ago. I think he can have a really great effect because one of my sentiments about catchers is the first thing you want in a catcher is defense, and any offense that you get is a plus. And that's really not what they had with Wilson Ramos, where he's a guy who can't play defensively, but he has a good bat. And McCann's going to help that rotation a lot, especially Noah Syndergaard when he comes back, because Syndergaard is he's very slow to the plate. But I think that this McCann deal is going to have a really big effect on the team.
No, I mean, your points are valid for sure. My only qualms with him defensively is it's a very small sample size of being a really good defensive player. If you go back a couple of years, he was one of the worst catchers defensively in baseball. I mean, with that said, he's been very open about the changes he's made, so I'm certainly not going to, say that he didn't make changes and they're not going to continue to work. But, we'll see how it goes. But I think, your points are super valid, especially in comparison to Wilson Ramos. I mean, Wilson Ramos literally was a statue back there, incapable of moving, no mobility whatsoever. And he didn't hit this past year the way that he had historically hit, which is what teams just dealt with his defense, kind of the opposite to your standpoint, is people that had Wilson Ramos were like, we'll take whatever he gives us defensively because, for a few years there, he was a 290, 310 hitter. Like, he was a guy that really hit. So that it just depends on kind of your team's makeup. But I agree that the Mets needed someone more defensive-minded for sure.
Yeah. And back to Taijuan Walker, he was actually the pitcher who pitched today. He pitched 4 innings, scoreless, 1 hit, 1 walk, and 3 strikeouts. And yesterday, Marcus Stroman pitched, I believe, 5 innings and 1 run earned. So 2 pretty good starts, and I mean, they look pretty promising to me. Of course, it is still spring training, but they still do look pretty good. And I know that Stroman, they offered him an $18 million deal, whereas Walker only is getting paid $10 million a year. So out of those 2 guys, do you think Walker might give more value to the team than Stroman, especially for the money that they're going to be paid?
Yeah, I mean, when you do kind of the, money to performance comparison, Walker might prove to be more worth his money than Stroman is. But I think Mets fans are underrating how good Stroman is as well. I think he's not your prototypical pitcher that you think of. He's not the guy that's going to throw 98 and strike out 12 guys and, utterly dominate. He's a small guy. I mean, and he even is proud of it. He has his brand, HDMH. Height doesn't measure heart. So, like, he's a small guy. I think he's 5'7", but he'll throw 7 different pitches. He knows how to cut the ball, sink the ball, slide the ball. Like, he could do anything with the baseball. He locates well. He's good with his delivery. So I think Stroman's in for a really nice year, and it's going to be tough next offseason. I mean, the Mets obviously we've already talked about Lindor, and we've talked about Syndergaard and Conforto a bit, and that adds Stroman to us. Those are all free agents. So at that point, you have to make a decision on how you're going to go forward if Stroman's going to be a part of it. But for this year, I think Walker has a chance to outperform in relation to contractual value, but I think Stroman's going to be a better pitcher.
Yeah. And one final question about the Mets. Yoenis Cespedes, who's an interesting guy, right? I don't think he's gotten signed yet to any teams. Do you think that he still has a future in the major leagues?
I think he's a DH. If he's going to be a DH, if you basically tell him don't even bring a glove to the ballpark, just bring your bat and your batting gloves and your cleats, he could play in the bigs for another 3 or 4 years, no question, because he can hit. I mean, you saw it when Cespedes missed all that time with the double heel surgery. He came back and hit a home run the first day. So, like, this guy could literally wake up out of a coma and hit a home run. So he can flat out rake. So I have to imagine there's going to be a point in time when he gets an opportunity to be a DH. But yeah, if he wants to continue playing, he just has to accept that he's going to be a DH going forward.
All right, and one last question, not about the Mets. March Madness started yesterday.
Yeah.
So, what team do you have winning all of March Madness?
So I'm not a basketball connoisseur, but I do a bracket because everyone in the world does a bracket. I picked Illinois. I think my final four was Gonzaga, Michigan, Ohio State, and Illinois. I don't really have much of a rhyme or reason why, but I know that I talked to just like a couple friends that follow college basketball a little bit and just use their guidance. So yeah, I picked Illinois, and I think that's not like crazy uncommon, but yeah, that's why I went with them versus Gonzaga in the championship.
I had the same exact championship, and I also had Illinois winning.
All right. Yeah. So hopefully we're both right.
Yeah, hopefully we both are right. Thank you so much, Joe, for coming on the show. I'd love to have you on another time if you like.
You got it, Evan. Anytime, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you.